Black history in Oklahoma largely begins with the removal of the 5 tribes from the southeastern United States. They crossed the country with great hardship and brought their slaves with them. Most people don't associate Oklahoma with plantations, but some of those Indian families established plantations in what was then known as Indian Territory, shipping cotton and other goods via steamboat down the Arkansas and Red Rivers. Some famous spiritual songs were written in Indian Territory, including Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, credited to Uncle Wallace Willis and Aunt Minerva, but the terms aunt and uncle were applied to African Americans rather casually. They were actually a father and daughter. Shortly before the Civil War, an incident happened in the Choctaw Nation where a female slave named Lucy, implicated in a murder, was publicly burned alive next to the dead body of the murderer because the victim's widow wished it so. The war divided families in the region. Many people sought refuge in Kansas, and there was much suffering and loss of property in Indian Territory. Kansas had the 1st Black Infantry Regiment, and there were battles in Indian Territory involving black troops. After the war, tribes were forced to emancipate their slaves, and these former enslaved people became known as freedmen. Choctaw freedmen, Cherokee freedmen. The various tribes did not all treat freedmen the same way, and the rights of these freedmen have been an ongoing issue. Following the war, more black soldiers came to Indian Territory, the 10th Cavalry in particular, to deal with hostilities in the West involving the Plains tribes, and these soldiers received the nickname Buffalo Soldiers. When the government opened lands to white settlement, they also opened it to black settlement, with many black families participating in the land runs to claim lands which previously had been held by Native Americans. The government continued breaking up Indian lands into individual allotments, with many former slaves and people of mixed race African and Native American ancestry also receiving land. The black population of Indian Territory and Oklahoma Territory owned more land than in other states, and founded more all-black towns than in other states. The flip side to that is that Oklahoma also developed a large number of white towns that were openly hostile to black people living there. They often put up signs warning black people it wasn't safe to remain after dark. During the territorial days, there were black lawmen like Deputy U.S. Marshal Bass Reeves, who was the most famous, and also a black Deputy U.S. Marshal named John Garrett, who wasn't famous, but he was murdered by the Rufus Buck Gang. They were a gang of Native American, black, and mixed ancestry criminals, and they weren't very famous either, but Idris Elba just played Rufus Buck in a Netflix movie. That's a little odd because Rufus Buck was young, possibly 21, half black, half Yuchi Indian, and went on a short, violent rampage. Idris Elba was 49, and his character had a long criminal past. In the territorial days, Eliza Carpenter made a name for herself as a horse trader, racehorse owner, and sometimes jockey, which was quite unusual for black women at the time. Horse racing was very popular back then. There had been forms of racial segregation during the territory days, but politicians were afraid that Oklahoma's constitution would be rejected if it had segregation in it, so they opted instead to make it the first order of business after Oklahoma became a state. Speaking of state government, Jim Noble was a black man who served at the state capitol for decades, but the story about him being the one who secretly carried the state seal from Guthrie to Oklahoma City, relocating the state capitol, is one that may or may not be true. People point to Governor Alfalfa Bill Murray supporting the theory as proof, but Alfalfa Bill Murray's book, The True History of Oklahoma, has many fanciful inaccuracies. By the time Oklahoma became a state, lynchings had declined as a form of frontier justice and steadily increased as a tool of racial violence. Souvenir postcards bear witness to those horrible crimes that happened in Oklahoma. The same is true for the Tulsa Race Massacre, which was the largest, but not the only, outbreak of racial violence in Oklahoma. It started with a young black shoeshiner named Dick Rowland, a young white elevator operator named Sarah Page, an accusation, and inflammatory rhetoric which led to black citizens coming downtown to prevent Dick Rowland from being lynched. A shot was fired, fighting broke out, and thousands of armed white citizens invaded, looted, and burned the prosperous black Greenwood district. Before that, it was known as Black Wall Street, and it was a shining example of black achievement and black prosperity. After being destroyed, it had a resurgence, but eventually suffered from the building of an expressway through the area and other factors. Bill Pickett was a famous black cowboy and rodeo star back when Wild West shows were popular, but he was also featured in a couple silent films with an all-black cast shot in Boley, an all-black town. His most famous rodeo stunt he performed with his teeth. A black woman named Ada Lois Sipule Fisher challenged state segregation laws when she enrolled at the University of Oklahoma Law School. The case went to the Supreme Court, resulting in the creation of a separate law school just for her. She argued it was inferior and not equal. The Supreme Court agreed with her, and she was eventually allowed into the University of Oklahoma Law School. She persevered and succeeded. The Katz Drugstore Sit-In is another story of challenging segregation policies. A group of young black students sat down at a lunch counter in Oklahoma City and ordered Cokes. Because of segregation policies, they hadn't been allowed to eat at the counter and would typically have to take their food to eat elsewhere. They returned each day sitting at the counter until one day they were finally served. And then they went to other establishments and did the same thing. Katz Drugstore was one of the first sit-down protests in the civil rights movement. There's more, but that's enough for now. Thank you for watching.